Ethan had always thought of himself as an ordinary guy, someone who lived a simple, almost mundane life. His daily routine was a quiet series of events. He woke up each morning, went to work, and spent the evenings alone, quietly existing in the ebb and flow of a life that was anything but extraordinary. For a while, that was enough for him. He had always felt detached from the chaos of the world around him, content with his own quiet existence. It wasn't that he disliked excitement. It was just that his life seemed to unfold in a way that did not demand much from him. He kept a small circle of friends, did his work diligently, and rarely found himself at the center of attention. But even in the dull routine, something about it all felt soothing to him. However, everything changed the day he moved into a small apartment located in a rundown part of the city, a decision spurred by the tumultuous events of his recent life. After a messy breakup and quitting his job, Ethan had found himself at a crossroads needing a fresh start. The apartment was cheap, which was one of the main reasons he had chosen it. He didn't have many options, and the idea of starting over somewhere affordable seemed to make sense. The building itself was old, and there was something about its worn exterior that felt both comforting and unfamiliar at the same time. The landlord, a man who seemed uninterested in asking too many questions, gave him the keys without hesitation. Ethan felt a sense of relief. Here was a place he could start anew away from the life he had known. At first, the apartment seemed like the perfect escape. It was a small unit on the third floor of the building, with the faint smell of wet wood and dust in the air. The hallway was dim with flickering light bulbs that cast an eerie glow. Like the world outside was muted behind a thin gray filter. The worn wooden floors creaked with every step, and the walls seemed to absorb sound, keeping everything quiet. The apartment itself was simple. There was a living room with a couch that looked like it had seen better days left behind by the previous tenant, and a tiny kitchen with peeling wallpaper. The bedroom had only a single window that faced a brick wall. The bathroom was cramped with a cracked mirror and a rusted sink, but Ethan didn't mind. He was used to living in places that weren't perfect. It felt like it could work. For the first few days, Ethan settled into his new home. He unpacked his things, put up a few posters on the walls, and tried to make the space feel more like his own. Despite the quietness of the building, Ethan felt hopeful. It was a fresh start, a new beginning. The silence in the apartment didn't bother him much at first. In fact, he appreciated the stillness. But as time went on, something about the apartment began to feel off. The quietness, which had initially been comforting, started to feel unnatural. There was an eerie quality to the stillness, as if the building was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Ethan hadn't yet met any of the neighbors, and the absence of any sound from other apartments felt unsettling. The building felt empty, but not in the way that an abandoned house might. It felt as though something was lurking just beyond his awareness. Sometimes at night he thought he heard faint footsteps from above, but there was no fourth floor. When he mentioned it to the landlord, the response was dismissive. He simply shrugged and said that the top unit had been sealed off years ago after a fire. Ethan didn't dwell on it much. He chalked it up to the strange quirks of old buildings. But the feeling of unease lingered. The first real incident that made Ethan uneasy occurred on the second night he spent in the apartment. As he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to fall asleep, he heard a soft, rhythmic tapping sound coming from the wall. It wasn't loud or jarring, just a subtle tap, 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 like someone was lightly drumming their fingers. At first, Ethan thought it was just the building settling, or perhaps the pipes expanding and contracting with the change in temperature, but when the tapping continued the next night at the exact same time, it felt too deliberate. It wasn't random. It was purposeful, as if someone was trying to get his attention. He pressed his ear to the wall, but there was nothing. The silence that followed felt heavier, like the building itself was watching him, waiting for him to react. For the next few days, the tapping continued every night. At the same time, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the apartment was somehow alive, that something was hidden just out of sight. He told himself it was nothing, just the noises of an old building, but it didn't feel like that. It felt like something else was happening. His days were spent in a haze of discomfort. The quietness of the apartment, which had once been a source of peace, now felt stifling. It was as though the air itself was thick with something unspoken. Every creak of the floorboards seemed to echo, and every flicker of the lights made him jump. The apartment didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a place where something was watching him. Things only got stranger from there. One day, while going through a kitchen drawer, Ethan found something unexpected. A small leather-bound notebook. It was hidden behind some old takeout menus covered in a thick layer of dust. He flipped it open expecting it to be empty, but as he turned the pages, he found a single note written in shaky handwriting. It watches when the lights go out. Ethan stared at the words for a long time. They felt like a message left by the previous tenant, but it was more than that. The words were unsettling. What did they mean? Why had the tenant left them behind? And why did it feel like the apartment was listening to him, waiting for him to react to the discovery? He tried to dismiss it as the ramblings of someone who had gone mad, but the thought stayed with him. That night, Ethan left a lamp on by his bed, hoping to ease the growing sense of dread. But when he woke up in the middle of the night, he felt something had changed. The room was colder than usual, and the shadows seemed thicker, more oppressive. The bedroom door, which he had always kept shut, was wide open. His heart raced as he realized that he hadn't opened it. The fear gripped him as he slowly walked toward the door. The hallway outside was dark, almost unnaturally so. The light switch didn't work, and when he flipped it, nothing happened. The apartment felt wrong, so wrong. He quickly shut the door and pushed a chair in front of it, as if it would somehow protect him. As the days wore on, the whispers began. At first they were faint, barely audible, but soon they became louder, clearer, like voices coming from behind a closed door or hidden in the walls. He checked the vents, the closets, and the bathroom, but found nothing. The voices persisted always when he was just about to fall asleep. They didn't make sense, only faint murmurs that seemed to call his name. His mind raced as he tried to explain it away, telling himself that it was just the stress of his recent life catching up with him. But deep down, he knew it was something more. The apartment had begun to feel like a prison, a trap. It was as though it was alive, feeding off his fears, slowly closing in on him. He stopped sleeping at night, instead staying up, drinking too much coffee, watching movies to distract himself from the voices. But the whispers continued gnawing at him, pushing him toward the edge of madness. Then one night it happened. Ethan had a dream, or perhaps it wasn't a dream at all. As he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he saw it, a faceless figure crouched in the corner of the room. It had no eyes, no mouth, just a smooth gray surface where its face should have been. It crawled down the wall, moving slowly, deliberately, like a spider. Ethan wanted to scream, but his body wouldn't respond. When the figure reached the foot of his bed, he woke up in a cold sweat, the room freezing. The lamp was still on, but the terror that gripped him didn't dissipate. The apartment had become something else, something dark and malevolent. It wasn't just a place to live anymore. It was a prison, and Ethan was trapped inside it. Ethan had always seen himself as an ordinary guy, living a life that didn't call for much attention or excitement. He worked as an office assistant at a law firm in downtown Seattle, a job that was steady but offered little in the way of thrill or challenge. His life, by his own admission, was simple, routine. Was his friend, and he enjoyed the peace it brought. But recently that routine had been shattered. A messy breakup with his longtime girlfriend and a decision to leave his old job had left Ethan feeling untethered and in need of a change. He was looking for a fresh start, something to give him new purpose, and that's when he stumbled across the apartment. It was small, affordable, and located in a less than desirable neighborhood on the edge of the city, a place Ethan hadn't even heard of before. The rent was right, and the landlord didn't ask too many questions. To Ethan, it seemed like a practical decision, and he didn't want to waste time searching for something perfect, when all he needed was a space to begin again. The building was old, with a history written in the faded brick walls and cracked windows. The smell of damp wood and mildew filled the hallways, and the flickering fluorescent lights made everything appear coated in a dull gray filter, as if the building itself had forgotten what it meant to be vibrant. But Ethan didn't mind much. He wasn't expecting luxury. In fact, he preferred the seclusion of the place, away from the noise of the more bustling parts of the city. The apartment itself was on the third floor of the building, the kind of place where no one would bother you. It was small, but it had everything he needed: a bed, a couch, a small kitchen, and a bathroom with a cracked mirror. The previous tenant had left a lot of their old furniture behind, including a worn-out couch that Ethan figured was good enough for him. He didn't need anything fancy. For the first few days, Ethan settled in quietly, unpacking his boxes and trying to make the space feel like his own. He put up a few posters on the wall, added some throw pillows to the couch, and even bought a couple of houseplants to give the place some life. But as he spent more time in the apartment, something began to feel off. At first, Ethan couldn't put his finger on it. He figured it was just the awkwardness of moving into a new place. But the longer he stayed, the more the silence started to creep in. The building, despite being old and worn, was unnervingly still. There was no noise from neighbors, No sounds of children playing outside, no cars driving by. The only thing that ever seemed to break the quiet was the occasional flicker of the lights in the hallway. Ethan didn't mind the quiet at first. In fact, he found it comforting. But that sense of calm soon gave way to an unsettling tension. It was as if the silence was waiting for something. Ethan never met any neighbors, and when he asked the landlord about it, the man had only shrugged. It was an old building, after all, with only a handful of tenants, most of them elderly or reclusive. Ethan could tell he wasn't getting the whole story, but he didn't press. He just wanted to settle into his new life. The quietness became increasingly disturbing. Late at night, Ethan would lie in bed trying to sleep, but he kept hearing noises, soft thuds, the faint creak of a floorboard, the almost imperceptible scratching sound that he couldn't place. At first, he dismissed it. It was just the building settling, he thought. But when the sounds persisted night after night, he began to feel a deep unease. One evening, after hearing a strange tapping on the wall, Ethan decided to investigate. He thought it might be pipes or maybe the wind, but when he pressed his ear against the wall, there was nothing. No sounds, no movement, just a thick pressing silence. He laughed it off, telling himself it was all in his head. Still that night, he lay in bed with his eyes wide open, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. The apartment was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where Ethan could escape the chaos of his life and find peace. Instead, it had become something else, a place of haunting isolation, an entity all its own. Ethan would go days without seeing anyone, and when he did, the few faces he encountered seemed to be just as strange as the building itself, the landlady, Mrs. Jacobs, was the only one he ever spoke to in the building, and even she didn't seem to want to engage much. There was a strange coldness to her, as if she had been waiting for something that didn't have a name. And then one night, when the silence in the apartment was particularly oppressive, Ethan found a small old notebook hidden in a kitchen drawer. The notebook was leather-bound and covered in dust, its pages yellowed and worn with age. As Ethan flipped through it, most of the pages were blank, save for one which contained a short cryptic message written in shaky handwriting. "It watches when the lights go out." At first, Ethan thought it was just some strange note left behind by the previous tenant, perhaps someone who was losing their grip on reality. But something about the words stuck with him. They were ominous, and they echoed in his mind long after he tossed the notebook aside. That night, unable to shake the unsettling feeling, Ethan left the light on in his bedroom, hoping it would give him some comfort. But when he woke in the middle of the night, something had changed. The room was cold, and the shadows seemed heavier, darker than before. He turned toward the bedroom door, only to find it open. He had always kept it shut. His heart pounded in his chest as he stood frozen, staring at the open door. He had not opened it. But before he could process what was happening, the feeling of being watched flooded over him. The apartment seemed to grow smaller, as though the walls were closing in. In a panic, he shut the door and pushed a chair in front of it, trying to rationalize his fear. But that night, sleep wouldn't come. The unsettling silence of the apartment became a constant presence, and soon Ethan began to question whether the apartment was really as empty as he had initially thought. The whispers began the following night. At first, they were faint, barely audible, but soon they grew louder, more distinct. It was as if someone was speaking from behind the walls, just out of reach, calling his name in a voice that was barely a whisper. Ethan checked every corner of the apartment, closets, vents, the bathroom, looking for an explanation. But there was nothing. The apartment was empty. Yet the whispers continued. It wasn't just the absence of sound that bothered him anymore. It was the presence of something unseen, something waiting in the dark. Ethan began to feel trapped, as though the apartment was alive, feeding off his fear. He couldn't explain why, but he knew something was wrong. There was something inside the apartment, something he couldn't see, but could feel creeping through the air, like a shadow just beyond his reach. It wasn't just the tapping sounds or the whispers that haunted him. It was the feeling of being watched, and that feeling grew stronger. As the days passed, Ethan had always been the type to find comfort in routine. His life, though nothing extraordinary, had been predictable. Steady work at a small law firm, quiet nights spent alone in his apartment. He never craved excitement, preferring the calm of his familiar surroundings. But when everything came crashing down after a messy breakup and the decision to leave his job behind, he knew it was time to step into the unknown. Moving into the cheap apartment was supposed to be the fresh start he needed. But what he didn't know was that the apartment would become his personal nightmare, a place where the walls seemed to watch him, listen to him, and whisper back. The building itself was a relic of the past. It was old, cracked, and worn, with narrow hallways, that smelled faintly of mildew and wood rot. The dim, flickering lights made the place feel like it was stuck in a perpetual dusk, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Ethan didn't mind at first. The loneliness of the place suited him just fine. But as he climbed the stairs to the third floor and unlocked the door to his new apartment, an unsettling feeling crept over him. The door creaked open and Ethan stepped inside. His new home, small, simple, with peeling wallpaper and a single window that faced a blank brick wall, was nothing special. But for some reason, as soon as the door closed behind him, a deep silence fell over the space. The kind of silence that doesn't feel comforting, but rather oppressive, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Waiting. For the first few days, Ethan tried to settle in. He unpacked his belongings, made a simple meal, and found some old posters to decorate the drab walls. But something didn't feel right. The building was too quiet. The neighbors never seemed to be home, and the air itself felt still, unnaturally still. It was as if the building was holding some dark secret, something Ethan couldn't see but could certainly feel. The silence was too thick, suffocating. It pressed in on him from every direction. Every night as he lay in bed, the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should, crawling across the room like something alive. The flickering hallway light cast odd shapes on the walls, and Ethan couldn't help but feel like he was being watched from the dark corners of the room. Then on the second night, the tapping began. At first, it was so faint that Ethan thought he imagined it. A soft, rhythmic tapping from the wall beside his bed, like fingers drumming lightly against the wood. It wasn't enough to be alarming, but it was enough to make him freeze listening. He told himself it was just the building settling. The pipe is shifting. But when the tapping came again, the next night at the exact same time, his heart skipped a beat. This time the noise was louder, more deliberate, like someone or something was trying to get his attention. His body tensed with dread and he lay still in the dark, trying to convince himself it was nothing. But the longer he listened, the more convinced he became that there was something in the walls, something that wanted him to hear it. As the days passed, the tapping continued. Every night like clockwork, the soft, unnerving sound would return always at the same hour. It was as if the apartment itself was alive, breathing with him. Ethan tried to ignore it, chalking it up to his overactive imagination, but it gnawed at him, creeping into his thoughts when he tried to sleep. He couldn't shake the feeling that the apartment was slowly getting inside his mind, twisting his perception of reality. It wasn't just the tapping anymore. Strange noises began to echo from the walls, whispers, faint murmurs that sounded like voices calling his name. Ethan pressed his ear against the walls, but all he could hear was silence. There was no one there. There couldn't be. But the whispers continued growing louder with every passing day until it felt as though they were coming from within his very bones. One evening, Ethan was searching through a drawer in the kitchen when his hand brushed against something unexpected. A small, leather-bound notebook lay hidden behind the old takeout menus, its cover covered in dust. Curiosity sparked within him, and he opened it. Most of the pages were blank, but as he turned to the last one, his stomach twisted. In shaky handwriting, the words read, "It watches when the lights go out." A chill ran down his spine. His first thought was that the previous tenant had been paranoid, or perhaps losing their mind. But as he stared at the words, something cold and terrifying settled in the pit of his stomach. The very idea of something watching him from the shadows made his skin crawl. That night, he left the lamp on beside his bed. He told himself it was just to ward off any potential nightmares. But when he woke up in the middle of the night, the room was colder than usual. The shadows, darker, thicker, seemed to crowd in around him, suffocating the air in the room. His heart began to pound in his chest as he turned to look at the bedroom door. It was wide open. He had always kept it shut. The breath caught in his throat as he bolted upright, his pulse racing. He had not opened it. In a panic, he got out of bed and walked cautiously toward the door, the floor creaking beneath him. The hallway was dark, colder than the room he had just left. He flipped the light switch, but the light didn't come on. It was as if the apartment was intentionally withholding any comfort. Ethan's breath quickened, his heart hammering in his chest. He closed the door, pushing a chair in front of it, as if somehow that would protect him. But the terror wouldn't leave. The air felt thick with a presence, something watching, waiting. The whispers returned the following night. This time they were louder, clearer, and unmistakable. They called his name, soft, breathy voices, as if they were coming from behind a door or deep within the walls themselves. Ethan checked every room in the apartment but found nothing. No one was there. The apartment was empty, yet the voices kept coming. At night, just as he was about to fall asleep, they grew stronger, as if the apartment was trying to reach him to communicate. One night as he laid in bed, the whispers grew to a crescendo and the temperature in the room dropped. His breath became visible in the frigid air. The walls creaked ominously as though something ancient and hungry was stirring just beyond the surface. That night, Ethan had a dream. Or maybe it wasn't a dream at all. He awoke in the middle of the night, his gaze drawn to the corner of the ceiling, where he saw it, a shape. It wasn't a person, it was something far worse. It was faceless. Smooth gray skin where a face should have been. The shape crawled down the wall, slow and deliberate like a predator closing in on its prey. Ethan's body froze in terror. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. He just lay there, paralyzed with fear. The thing crawled down the wall closer and closer until it was inches away from his face. And then, just as it reached the foot of his bed, everything went dark. When he woke, he was drenched in sweat, the lamp still flickering weakly beside him. But the terror didn't end with the dream. It lingered, a heavy weight pressing against him. He had seen it, and he couldn't forget it. The apartment wasn't just a home anymore. It was something worse. It had become a trap, a living, breathing thing, and Ethan was its prey. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer alone in the apartment. It wasn't just the tapping or the whispers anymore. It was something deeper, something more sinister. The walls themselves seemed to be alive, pulsing with a malevolent energy. The shadow that had once been confined to his nightmares now seemed to stretch beyond them. Every corner of the apartment felt like it was closing in on him, suffocating him with its presence. The air was thick, heavier than it should have been, and at night it felt as though the very room itself was watching him. He tried to escape the dread by keeping busy, working long hours, spending time at the coffee shop, and even running errands, but no matter how far he went, it felt like the apartment was always with him. The whispers, faint but persistent, seemed to follow him, as though they were somehow etched into his very being. The worst part wasn't just the fear, it was the feeling that he was losing control. He stopped sleeping, instead choosing to sit in the middle of the living room, lights blazing around him. But even the light didn't seem to keep the darkness at bay. It was as if the apartment had found its way into his mind, slowly eroding his sense of self. His reflection in the bathroom mirror became distorted, delayed. Every time he looked into it, his image would lag just behind his own movements, like it was mocking him. Once, when he stared too long, his reflection blinked after him, not in sync, but deliberately, as though it was doing so on its own accord. The next time he looked, his reflection wasn't his anymore. It was someone else's, someone faceless, someone with hollow eyes. It was only for a split second, but it was enough to send him stumbling backward, his hands shaking with a terror so raw he couldn't breathe. He smashed the mirror in a fit of panic, the sound of the glass shattering filling the silence of the apartment like an explosion. He stood there for a long time, staring at the jagged edges, hoping it would somehow bring him relief. But the terror didn't stop, it only grew. It was during one of these nights of dread that Ethan noticed something new. His living room window, which he had always kept shut to block out the noise of the street below, was wide open. He hadn't opened it. It had always been difficult to move with the latch, stiff and resistant, and yet here it was, wide open, the cool night air drifting in. The thought of someone sneaking into his apartment chilled him to the bone. But as he approached the window, a cold wave of fear washed over him. Papers from his desk had been blown across the room, some caught in the breeze, and on the inside of the window frame, something had been scratched into the wood. It was just one word, but it was enough to make Ethan's blood run cold. Stay. He felt the walls of the apartment press in on him, suffocating him, and he realized with terrifying clarity that whatever was in the building wasn't just a force outside of him. It had been inside him all along. The whispers, the shadow in the corner, the strange occurrences, all of it was an invasion of his mind, his reality. The apartment was no longer just a place, it had become a part of him, seeping into his very thoughts. Whatever haunted this place had started to infect him. It wasn't just about a haunting anymore. It was about something much darker, a force that fed off fear and helplessness, growing stronger with every passing day. The next day, Ethan called the landlord, desperate for answers. His name was Mr. Jacobs, and he'd always been a quiet, almost dismissive man. When Ethan explained the bizarre happenings, the strange noises in the open window, Mr. Jacobs didn't seem surprised. He sighed heavily on the phone as if he had heard it all before. "You're not the first to complain," he muttered. "People don't stay in Unit 3B for long. Some say the place is cursed." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "Cursed? What do you mean?" he asked, feeling his voice tremble despite his attempts to remain calm. Mr. Jacobs was quiet for a long moment before answering. There was a fire years ago in the top unit. Well, it was sealed off after some strange things started happening in the building. People said they saw things. The last tenant, Carter, went missing, just disappeared, left all his stuff behind. The police couldn't find him. The weight of the words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. Carter, the name meant nothing to him, but the fact that someone had simply vanished from this very apartment was enough to send chills down his spine. That night, the whispers returned louder, clearer, more insistent. They came from the walls, from the cracks in the floor, from the very air itself. Ethan. They hissed, the sound barely above a breath. It's waiting. And then it started, the scratching, on at first like nails tapping against wood, but it grew louder, more desperate. Ethan's heart raced in his chest as the sound grew frantic, as if something was clawing from the other side. He pressed his hands over his ears, but the noise still came louder and more frantic. His head throbbed with the intensity of it, and he felt his sanity slipping. When the noise stopped abruptly, Ethan dared to look up. The walls were marked with long gouges, deep, thin scratches running down from near the ceiling or to the floor. It was like the walls had been clawed at by something desperate, something trying to escape. The terror was no longer something he could ignore. It had become real, tangible, crawling through the very fabric of the apartment. It was inside him now. It was the very air he breathed, the pulse of his heartbeat. Ethan felt his grip on reality slipping. He wasn't sure what was real anymore. He hadn't been able to sleep for days, but even in his waking moments, he felt trapped in a nightmare. The apartment itself had become a prison, and there was no escape. The whispers followed him, even when he left the apartment. They called to him from the park, from the grocery store, even from the street. It was as though whatever haunted him had attached itself to him. The very thing that stalked him in the apartment had found a way into his soul, and now it was following him wherever he went. One day, after spending the night in complete darkness, Ethan decided to take action. He couldn't stay in this apartment any longer. The fear had become too much. But even as he packed his things, the feeling that something was watching him never left. His movements were slow, deliberate. His skin felt tight, like something was crawling under it. He glanced at the walls one last time, but it was too much. The apartment had already taken too much from him, and then just as he was about to leave, he saw it, something small, just out of the corner of his eye. A face, not his. A face that had no features, just smooth skin where a face should be, a mouth stretched wide, an empty, gaping mouth. Ethan couldn't breathe. The air was thick, suffocating as he stared at the thing. It was standing in the corner watching him. And just like that, everything went dark. Ethan's mind was unraveling, threads of reality snapping one by one as the apartment's grip tightened around him. The shadows that had once only lurked in the corners of his vision were now full-fledged, tangible figures inching closer with each passing hour. But apartment had stopped being a place of refuge. It had become a living entity, one that watched and waited, feeding off his fear. His reflection had turned into something that no longer resembled him, a twisted version of his face with hollow eyes and a mouth that moved without his permission. The whispers didn't stop. They came during the day and in his dreams and in the quiet of the night. The space that once seemed empty now felt full of unseen eyes. It was as if the apartment had consumed him, making him a part of its malevolent force. His body no longer felt like his own. He hadn't slept in days. His skin was pale, his eyes sunken, and the hollow feeling in his chest never subsided. He knew he couldn't stay there any longer, but the idea of leaving the apartment filled him with terror. The door no longer felt like an exit. It felt like a trap waiting to close behind him. What would happen if he left? Could he escape it? Or would whatever had taken hold of the apartment follow him, dragging him deeper into madness? That night, the worst of the horrors came to life. Ethan sat on the couch, staring at the walls, his eyes glazed with exhaustion, when he noticed something shifting in the corner of his eye. At first, it was subtle, just a flicker, a shadow where there shouldn't be one. But then as he turned to face it, the shadows grew thick, swirling masses of darkness, coiling together like smoke, taking shape. He knew it. The faceless thing was back. But this time it wasn't in his dreams. It was real. It was here. The figure crawled out from the corner, slow and deliberate, its skin smooth and gray, with no eyes, no mouth, just a hollow void where a face should have been. The room grew colder, the air heavy, and the lights flickered, casting sharp shadows across the walls. The thing's long fingers scraped against the floor as it moved toward him, dragging its weight like a predator. inching closer to its prey. Ethan's heart raced, his breath shallow. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't respond. He was frozen in place, paralyzed by the overwhelming fear coursing through him. The thing came closer, its form shifting in the darkness, its hand reaching out toward him. Its presence filled the room, suffocating him with its malice. He could hear its breath, or rather, the absence of it. It was a void, an emptiness that surrounded him, tightening like a vice. "You came back." The thing whispered, its voice coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You opened the door." The walls trembled as if the apartment itself was alive, echoing the words that came from the faceless creature. Ethan could barely move, the horror of the situation stealing his ability to think or act. He had no idea how long he sat there staring at the thing as it reached out its hand inches from his face. Suddenly, a voice cut through the darkness. It was weak, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. "Ethan." It was the voice of the psychic, the one who had tried to help him weeks ago. He hadn't seen her since she had been dragged into the crack in the wall by the shadows. Her voice was distant but clear. "Find the source, close the door." Ethan's heart leapt in his chest. The door. The crack in the wall, the apartment, the thing had been feeding off his fear, slowly pulling him into its grasp. But now he had the answer, the source of the horror. It wasn't just the apartment. It was what lay beyond it, something ancient, something hungry. It had been waiting for him, waiting for the moment he would open the door. With a surge of determination, Ethan stood, though his legs shook beneath him. The faceless figure didn't move, didn't speak, but Ethan could feel its eyes on him. It was watching, shouting. He rushed toward the kitchen, his hands shaking as he grabbed the bone, the one he had found behind the fridge, the small, cursed object that seemed to be at the center of it all. He clutched it tightly, the red thread unraveling from it like some twisted omen. He didn't think. He acted on instinct. He turned and bolted toward the bedroom, the crack. The source, he had to close it, but when he reached the wall, it was already worse than he had imagined. The crack had grown larger, more jagged, like a wound in the fabric of reality itself. The space beyond it was pure darkness, a void that seemed to suck the light from the room. Faint whispers called from the depths, beckoning him into the abyss. With trembling hands, Ethan pressed the bone into the crack, the red thread wrapped tightly around it. For a moment, nothing happened. The darkness remained still. But then, as if the world itself was holding its breath, the crack began to pulse. It was alive. The air grew colder, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch toward him. The thing in the corner hissed, but Ethan didn't flinch. He whispered the words he had heard from the psychic. "I return what I stole. I close what I open." The room erupted in chaos. The walls shook violently, and the apartment seemed to scream in agony. The crack in the wall widened, darkness flooding the room like a living nightmare, stretching out to claim him. Ethan screamed in defiance, his voice lost in the chaos as the darkness surged forward. The bone began to glow, casting a faint light, but it was too late. With a final earth-shattering screech, the crack sealed itself. The darkness withdrew, and for the first time in weeks, the apartment was silent. The thing, the faceless entity, was gone. The air was still empty. Ethan collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, his body racked with exhaustion. The walls no longer pulsed. The whispers had stopped. The apartment, which had been his prison, now felt like a lifeless shell. But Ethan knew deep down that this wasn't the end. It wasn't over. The apartment had let him close the door, but the terror had already taken root in him. The darkness was no longer confined to the walls. It was in him, a part of his soul, a whisper that would never truly leave. His breath quickened as the reality of it set in. The thing had left, but something was still there, following him. Lurking just beneath the surface, Ethan slowly stood, looking around the room one last time. The apartment, once a place of safety, now felt like a hollow tomb. He stepped toward the door, his heart heavy with dread. The apartment might have been silent now, but there was a small, lingering doubt in his mind, a doubt that would follow him wherever he went. The shadows had never truly left him. And as he opened the door to leave, the faintest whisper filled his ears. "You can leave, but not me." Ethan turned. There, just beyond the doorway, was a crack in the wall. Ethan's fingers trembled as he reached for the door, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum. The whisper, the faint, chilling voice, lingered in his mind, echoing through the halls of his thoughts. "You can leave, but not me." He turned to look at the wall, his eyes drawn to the crack that had started to form. It wasn't wide yet, but it was unmistakable, like a seam in the world stretching slowly toward him. His mind raced, but his body was already moving. He had to get out. He had to escape this place before it swallowed him whole. His grip on the doorknob tightened, and for a moment his body went stiff as the weight of his decision hit him. Could he really leave? Would it follow him, this entity, this dark presence that had been clinging to him for so long? It was as if the apartment had been a living thing, and in the moment he decided to step into the outside world, he realized it wasn't just the apartment that was haunted. It was him. The darkness had seeped into his very soul. No matter where he went, he would carry it with him, just as he had carried the whispers, the visions, the nightmares. But he couldn't stay here. He couldn't keep living in a place where the walls were alive with fear, where the silence was thick with malevolent intentions. The thing in the corner, basically the faceless horror, might be gone, but he knew deep down it had left its mark on him. It would never be over. It had taken something from him, and no matter what he did, he couldn't undo the damage. A heavy breath escaped his lips, and for the first time in weeks he felt something shift inside him. Not the crushing weight of terror, but the faintest glimmer of resolve. He wasn't going to let this thing control him. He wasn't going to let it follow him forever. Ethan stepped into the hallway, leaving the apartment behind him. As the door clicked shut, the feeling of dread that had clung to him for so long seemed to lift just a little. But as he walked down the dark, quiet hallway, he couldn't shake the sense that something was still watching him. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled, and his pulse quickened. He forced himself to keep moving, to leave the building, to get as far away as possible. But no matter how fast he walked, it felt like the apartment was closing in on him, following him in the corners of his mind. The whispers had never truly stopped. When he finally stepped out onto the street, the cool night air hit his face like a breath of fresh air. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking in the reality of the outside world. The sound of traffic, distant voices, the hum of the city. It was all normal, but even as he stood there breathing in the night, he knew it wasn't over. A shadow flickered in the corner of his eye. He spun around, heart racing, but the street was empty. There was no one there. The air felt thicker again, as if something was pressing down on him from above. He felt his stomach twist. He wasn't alone. He hadn't escaped it. The whispers returned, faint at first, then clearer. Ethan. His breath caught in his throat, and the words seemed to come from inside his head, not just from the street. You opened the door. You let it in. Ethan staggered back, his mind reeling. The voice wasn't just behind him. It was inside him, speaking to him in a language that was both his own and not. The feeling of dread swelled, growing with each passing second. He thought he could leave it all behind, but it had already embedded itself deep within him. The whispers, the shadows, the faceless figure. It wasn't just in the apartment, it was in him. He turned, eyes wild, scanning the street for any sign of escape. But the city around him seemed to bend and warp, its familiar streets twisting into unfamiliar darkened alleys. He could feel the presence in the shadows, the weight of it closing in around him. The crack in the wall had spread, fracturing everything he knew, and he was its prisoner. Ethan's legs gave out and he collapsed onto the cold pavement, his breath ragged, his body shuddering. It's not over, the realization slammed into him harder than any fear he had felt before. The darkness wasn't tied to the apartment. It wasn't tied to the walls. It was tied to him. No matter where he went, no matter how far he ran, he could never escape it. The ground beneath him began to tremble, as if something deep within it was awakening. The shadows grew, thickening into dark shapes, swirling like smoke surrounding him. Ethan could hear them, dozens of voices whispering his name, growing louder until it was deafening. And then, in a moment of pure suffocating terror, Ethan felt something cold and heavy settle deep inside his chest. It was like a weight, something ancient and unknowable, something that had always been there but only now fully revealed itself. It was in him. It had always been in him. You cannot escape, the whispers breathed. You are mine now. The ground cracked open beneath him, and Ethan felt himself falling, plummeting into a void of pure darkness. The shadows engulfed him, and the world he had known was swallowed by the abyss. And as the darkness closed in, he knew the apartment wasn't just a building. It was a door. And now Ethan had become part of that door. No escape from the darkness within.